So welcome back to everyone. You were in the Jane Austen session earlier, and hello and welcome to everyone that's joining us for this session today. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers and the topic that we'll be looking at today or now. So we're looking at the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, which was a book written by Anne Sebba, and it's released now on sale outside, and chairing the event will be Kate Williams. So I'll do a proper introduction. So Kate Williams is a royal expert TV historian and professor of public engagement with history at the University of Reading. She's the author of several acclaimed historical biographies, including England's Mistress, Becoming Queen, Young Elizabeth, Rival Queens, and her latest book, The Royal Palace's Secrets and Scandals, is out now. We're also going to have the pleasure of Kate returning later on today at 5 p.m. to host her own event looking at royal scandals and queens, so we'll do a fuller introduction then. But Kate is chairing the event and sharing the research and story behind her latest book is Anne Sebba. So Anne Sebba is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, a biographer, lecturer, journalist from Reuters, former Reuters foreign correspondent, and author of 11 books for adults, including Ethel Rosenberg, An American Tragedy, Les Parisiennes, How the Women of Paris Loved and Died, and in the 1940s, and That Woman, The Life of Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor. Her latest book, as I've mentioned, is The Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, and it's on that we'll be having the conversation today. So welcome, Kate and Anne. Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. And it's such a privilege to be here interviewing Anne about this such a powerful book. Now, I'm a long-term fan of Anne's work. I love That Woman. I love Ethel Rosenberg. I love The Parisiennes. And I don't think that anyone will ever write a better biography of Wallis Simpson. I just think That Woman is brilliant. Yeah. But this is an absolutely transcendent book. I mean, this is incredible. Anne was just making me an idle threat in the green room that she wouldn't write another book. And I just know it's not true because she's an absolute genius and must go on to many more books. But this book is so important, so moving and full of all these detailed stories. So this Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, I mean, Anne, what made you want to write about the Women's Orchestra?
I've always wanted to write about the Holocaust. I think if you're a historian of the 20th century, it's the central calamity. You can't avoid it. But I have been skirting around it in my books. People think I concentrate on women, and that's true, I do. But actually, the thread is 1936, because I think 1936 is a key year in world history when we could have stopped Hitler by... he marched into the Rhineland, tearing up the Treaty of Versailles. In France, there was a Popular Front government led by Léon Blum, which didn't last. In Spain, there was a civil war, and in England, we were faffing around worried about a king and his morals. So, you know, though...
Well, that's it, isn't it? They were so distracted. Stanley Baldwin was rearming, but they were also distracted by the king.
Completely. Was there going to be a king? And in the event, there wasn't. So, you know, I'm not a great fan of the what-if version of history, but I do think those years between World War I and World War II are absolutely intriguing. And as I say, I've skirted around the Holocaust because I felt I'm not a survivor, I'm not the child of survivors. What right do I have to tell this story? But thankfully, I've been able to write this story because I found a way in. It almost was a way of giving me permission to write this story. So I was researching Belsen because that's another of my things that I can't understand why Belsen in the British historical psyche isn't given more importance. I think the fact that it was British troops who liberated Belsen, which was a camp that the Nazis had not evacuated, so they could see the Nazi crimes there, and they were unimaginable. And the evidence was there before the Nazis
had... very powerful about the skeletal people that they just saw in front of them.
Dying piles of dead bodies and starving people and cannibalism and just complete lack of order and illness and disease. And the British not only controlled this slowly and brought order to all of this and had set up hospitals and had to deal with all the displaced people who were being sent from all the other camps, swelling the numbers at Belsen. They slowly brought it under control and dealt with the displaced people. So, I mean, why don't more people think about Belsen as a great British victory in a way? I mean, because it was a terrible camp, you can't call it a victory. But we talk about Dunkirk, which was a terrible failure, as a great moment in British military history. So anyway, I was researching Belsen because I've often felt that it's not been given its due in British...
You would make the interesting point that the BBC was there and they didn't broadcast the broadcast because they thought that no one would...
Young Richard Dimbleby, who was only 32, made this extraordinary broadcast, and the BBC refused to air it. They said the British public won't believe it. And he stood his ground, and it was a few days later when eventually it was aired. So, you know, there are all these aspects of Belsen, but it doesn't have the cachet, if you like, for a publisher to want a book about Belsen. There have been books. But as I was researching it, suddenly my son said to me, I don't know why you keep researching other people's stories. Why don't you research your own father? You know, in his case, Grandpa, my father, was at Belsen, which I had known, but like many people of that generation, he didn't want to talk about it. And if I ever discussed it with him, he would say, well, I wasn't there at the liberation, as if being there a week or a couple of weeks later didn't matter. So I never talked about it with my father, who's been dead for many years. Finally, I went to the National Archives at Kew, which is right next door to where I live. So, you know, I really should have gone sooner. And there I found my own father's war diary with his signature.
That's astonishing.
Which was
Your father's
really...
war diary was in the National Archives.
Visceral. He kept the regimental diary in Belsen, and on May the 24th, with his signature, I read that he was organising for the Churchill flamethrower tanks, you know, these incredibly powerful things with jets of fire to destroy the lice-ridden huts of Belsen because there was no other way. And on May the 24th, I already knew from other research at the Wiener Library that the remnants of the orchestra, who the Nazis had moved to Belsen, the Jewish part of the orchestra, were giving a Red Cross concert. So the fact that I found these two events on the same day, I've convinced myself...
Incredible.
My father must have been to a concert. He must have heard some members of the orchestra. And once I discovered that, well, you know the feeling when research really brings up something.
Incredible.
You think, this is so exciting, and I must research more. So I became obsessed. That's what led into it. And I wanted then to research how the orchestra ended up at Belsen, who they were, because there was just half of them in Belsen, the Christian half. One of the really ridiculous aspects of how the Nazis viewed the orchestra, which in its heyday had to be half Christian and half Jewish. But when the Nazis were worried that the Russians were coming and they wanted to evacuate Auschwitz, they separated them again. They sent the Jewish members to Belsen in a train, and the Christian members had to do the death march to Ravensbrück. So there was so much I had to learn, but I've been completely obsessed by understanding this story, and I'm sure we'll talk about why there was an orchestra in the first place, which is another nonsense that you can't really explain in rational terms.
It's so powerful, and and obviously we'll go back onto Belsen initially, but you know, as they at the Jewish side, they went to Belsen, and there they wanted to be an orchestra again, didn't they? They tried to reform, and the camp commandant said no, but they were so determined to keep up this orchestra. But let's go back to Auschwitz. So we're in Auschwitz. Why? I mean, music is the most beautiful form of art. It is sublime. Why? It seems so difficult to understand why something so beautiful would be in a place of such horror. Why is there an orchestra, a women's orchestra in Auschwitz?
Well, it wasn't beautiful music. That's the first thing. It was awful music. It was marching music.
You say it's an abuse of music, don't you?
It was an abuse of music. It was a perversion of music. It was another Nazi tool, really. It was a form of torture to make these women play da-dum, 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 to the other women prisoners who were going out to work. So I'm sure all of you know, but Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II, or Birkenau, where the women's orchestra was surrounded by these sub-camps. So the other women prisoners, and these were mostly the non-Jewish women, because the Jewish women were largely gassed. And when Jews arrived in Auschwitz, they were either taken straight to the gas chambers, or if it was thought they had some useful skill about them, some of the Jewish women, and I'm talking about a handful.
You say it's like tailors were very popular.
Yes, I was going to say the sewing commando. All the other squads were known as commandos. So as the Nazis took all the clothes of the incoming prisoners, the sewing squad remade them in fashionable ways for the German women. So there was the sewing commando, the kitchen, the laundry, Canada, which was the warehouse, or the office. I mean, there were various ways of staying alive, possibly. I mean, not everybody did. But the orchestra, which only existed for about 18 months, and under its heyday, 9 months, under Alma Rosé, was used, back to your question, a bit of a digression there, was used as a marching band. I mean, the women themselves didn't call themselves an orchestra, they called themselves a girls' band, which is really what they were. 11 different nations, vast differences in approach, in outlook, in religion. Even amongst the Jews, there were Zionists, atheists, Orthodox. I mean, terrific variety of outlook, ages from 14, 15 to 50, but several young girls who may have had just 2 years in school playing the recorder, who Alma tried to save because she knew it was within her power to save. And we must come back and talk about who Alma was. But I'm still trying to set the scene as to why this orchestra existed. So the Nazis thought that if they had a marching band, that the women prisoners would go out to work looking sharper, that it would give an air of military discipline to the camp, which it wasn't a military camp at all, it was an extermination camp, but if people came to visit. So that was one of the reasons. And when the Nazis realized that actually under Alma, the Nazis could play beautiful music, they ordered her to give Sunday concerts for about 3 hours. So exhausted Nazis, after gassing thousands of people, needed something to unwind, and they loved listening to this beautiful music. But the main purpose was to feed the Nazi mania for counting. So the women prisoners had to form up at dawn or even earlier after roll call in rows of 5, so the Nazis could count them more easily, 5, 10, 15, 20. You know, it somehow seemed to suit the Nazi idea that this wasn't really an extermination camp, it was benign and run as with sort of military discipline. Now, there were lots of male orchestras, and a few
So there was up to 15 male orchestras?
Yes, and in other camps there were even mixed orchestras, but this is the only all-women's orchestra. Why? Well, I think probably because women in the 30s were not professional musicians. I mean, when did the Vienna Philharmonic start taking women? Yesterday? I mean, you know, it's just staggering.
You write brilliantly on how most women, some women had some musical education, but it was really training them to play the instrument at home with fathers and brothers.
Or to play family quartets.
Ladies weren't supposed to play the cello, were they? Because there was something between your legs.
Yes.
I don't know.
You're absolutely right.
So a lot of them, this is it. You have this women's orchestra, but a lot of them, as you say, had only been playing the recorder for a couple of years at school.
And or the mandolin. I mean, the mandolin was a really sort of middle-class instrument, not just amongst Jews. I've got a picture of a Polish school where the entire school played the mandolin. Who plays the mandolin now? But it was considered sort of ladylike. Well, you can't have a marching band full of piccolos, recorders, mandolins, and the odd violin.
Because there was no brass section, was there?
No brass section. There were a number of pianists, because that also was a sort of good middle-class accomplishment. But you can't have pianos, although we'll come to how Alma did get a Bechstein Grand at one stage, but several of the pianists were able to adapt their skills to play the accordion. And Flora Jacobs, this wonderful Dutch woman that I do write about a bit, she talks about how even though she was ill, she went to an audition to play the accordion, but it wasn't her primary instrument. And there were 150 women who went to try and get a place in the orchestra. That's how desperate these women were, and they saw the orchestra as a route to survival. But I just want to say the other reason why this women's orchestra was set up was the Nazi guard, Maria Mandel. And although I hate talking about her in some ways, she's so fascinating and interesting and complicated that we have to deal with the Nazi mentality.
So it's partly her motivation to get a women's orchestra in the women's bloc.
Well, so Maria Mandel, I absolutely do not want to excuse her brutality, her sadism, her appalling random cruelty. You know, she would walk about the camp with a leather whip tucked into her boot, and she'd just pull it out for any reason and thwack somebody if it suited her. And, you know, one of the reasons could be if you had a little curl, because your hair was shaved, but the orchestra were given the privilege of allowing their hair to grow back. So if she saw a curl that escaped a headscarf, that was a good reason for a kick. And of course, for the women marching, if they put their right foot forward, not their left, and were out of step, they'd get a Nazi kick, and they were probably so weak and feeble, they'd fall to the ground, and then they'd get a second kick, and they might not survive that. So I'm not in any way excusing Maria Mandel's sadism and brutality. However, joining the female, becoming a guard in one of the female camps was a route to a job. And if you look back at her youth and adolescence, it was difficult for her to get a job. So getting a job in the Nazi hierarchy gave her respect, it was well paid, and the women were always inferior. They never had the power that the SS male guards had, because actually the women weren't, although they're sometimes called female SS, that's a nonsense. It was the men who were the SS and the women who were simply the female guards. So there was a lot of jockeying for position amongst the women themselves, and they reached higher levels the crueler they were, but also to have an orchestra of your own, because it was a sort of pet project, gave her this authority vis-à-vis the men. But the real reason was that she had a lover in the camp, a Nazi architect, and she thought that if she had her own orchestra, it would make her look more cultured and bring her up a step vis-à-vis this man who she wanted to impress. I do think she liked music. There's a story that when she was a guard in Ravensbrück, she was heard playing the piano. So she probably had a love of music, which she fostered because she believed that made her look good in the eyes of this particular man that she was trying to impress. So she was the one responsible for setting up the orchestra, and it had 3 iterations. So when she started, all she could find was a Polish teacher who had been on a...
So what point is this when they started? What year are we in?
43.
43. And so she's looking for about 50 women to be in this orchestra. And as you say, she can't find anyone.
No, she starts off with 1 or 2. She asks for volunteers. And the first iteration of the orchestra had to be entirely Christian. So they went into the blocks asking for who was musical. So this woman called Zofia Tchaikovska, who was a Polish teacher who'd been on a demolition squad, absolutely exhausted, and knew she would never survive unless she found a way out of this terrible demolition squad she was sent on every day. And she persuaded Mandel that actually by being called Tchaikovska, she was a relation of Tchaikovsky, which Mandel may have fallen for or may just have thought, well, it suited her. So Zofia Tchaikovska, being a Polish teacher, had a few Polish folk tunes in her head and used these and played from memory. Probably something a bit like that, actually. You know, tum-tum-tiam, tum-tum-tum, and used a few of her Polish teacher friends who all had the same experience of running choirs and, as I say, playing from memory these basic Polish folk tunes, but it was floundering because they had a very small repertoire, just a few instruments. They weren't particularly talented, but there was a drummer and a few violinists, and Mandel wondered if she could really keep it going at this low level. It wasn't serving any purpose, when something extraordinary happened. So Alma Rosé, who I mentioned, who was the main conductor for 8.5 months, Alma Rosé was the niece of Gustav Mahler. Gustav Mahler...
Which is amazing. I mean, it's incredible to me. She's Mahler's
musical royalty, completely, but not Jewish anymore. Of course, Mahler was, but he'd converted to Catholicism. Alma's mother was Justine, Mahler's sister, and she too had converted. Alma's father, Arnold Rosé, was a top violinist in Vienna, and he'd converted to Protestantism. So Alma was baptized. She'd probably never been in a synagogue, did not identify as Jewish at all, but of course, in Nazi eyes, she had Jewish blood. So she was a really virtuoso violinist, an A-list.
Her father was a violinist as well, wasn't he? And they played. So tell us about the one recording that we can find of them.
Yeah, well, if you go to YouTube, there is only one recording of Alma and her father playing the Bach double. I was asked just a week or so ago in one of these talks whether there were any recordings in Auschwitz of the women's orchestra, and if I'd been really quick on my feet, I would have said, oh yes, there was a recording studio in Auschwitz, of course, go and look it up. Sadly, of course, there is no recording of the women's orchestra in Auschwitz, no photographs either, but there is this 1928 recording of Alma and her father shortly after her debut in 1926, and it's just heartbreaking to hear it because Alma didn't survive. All the orchestra, thanks to her, did, but she died of food poisoning.
So she and her father got to England, hadn't they? They managed to escape to England.
Yeah. Gosh, I'm so impressed. You know my book so well.
But I'm just so heartbroken that they got to England.
Yes.
He got safe, but then she went to the Netherlands, didn't she?
Well, she was really worried about her. She was intensely close to her father. Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, who's still alive, the only member of the orchestra still alive, who I've really benefited from the privilege of interviewing, I think felt that Alma was too close to her father. It was a really, really strong relationship. So Alma, having got to England at the outbreak of war, having been divorced from this other top violinist Czech called Vasha Prioda, and there wasn't room in that marriage for two virtuoso violinists. So Alma had been a conductor of waltzing maidens, as she called them, and they played a lot of Strauss waltzes. But she deposited her father in England, recognised that he had no means of earning a living, so foolishly went back to Europe thinking, I'll be safe, I've got a Czech
Netherlands,
passport. But no, it was not safe. And so she was picked up and taken to Drancy and eventually arrived at Auschwitz. When she arrived at Auschwitz, because she was in her late 30s, she was taken to the experimentation block in Auschwitz I.
Fertility celebration. Fertility and
it's so appalling. They did these pseudo experiments on fertility and sterilization, really, and no anesthetic was given, and she knew she wouldn't survive. So for her dying wish, she asks for a violin to be brought to her. Now, Auschwitz, as we know, is this terrible place where people are killed and gassed, but it's also a place of great riches, because when the Jews were deported, they were told to bring their most precious possessions, and many of them brought their instruments. So this warehouse, which was known as Canada because of all its riches, had amazing supply of instruments. So somebody brought her a fine violin, and she played this sublime music that you mentioned in the introduction. And the guards in the experimentation block knew immediately, this is no ordinary violinist. You know, this is someone of supreme talent. So they summoned Maria Mandel to come and listen to her. And Mandel saw and heard and realized, this is the way my orchestra can be saved. So Alma was given a chance to live if she could run the orchestra that was floundering under Tchaikovsky. And Alma, because she was that sort of personality, made certain demands, and they had their own block, and she doubled the size of the orchestra so that she could save more Jews, because from this point on, it was half Jewish, half Christian.
So we've got about 50 women, but Alma, she is very strict, isn't she? Because I think, as you say in the book, she's terrified that if they mess up, they could be in real trouble. So they rehearse. She becomes the director of the orchestra, and they're rehearsing for 10 hours a day, as well as playing when the workers go out. So they play when the workers go out in the morning, and they play when the workers come in.
All day long.
And then they're rehearsing in the middle as well.
Yes. It was no soft option being in the orchestra. And when you think that a professional orchestra today, I understand, may rehearse for 2 hours, 3 hours. So they put the music stands out at dawn after roll call, had to form up on the grassy mound as the prisoners went out for work. That was bad enough. Then they came back and they rehearsed and practiced. And then they had to go back at the end of the day, which was appalling, seeing these half-starved, exhausted women carrying half-dead bodies. But there was no let-up. And that's why Alma is such an intriguing personality, because I don't think she was a Yehudi Menuhin. I don't think we'd be talking about her as a #1 world-famous virtuoso violinist. I'm sure she was very good. We're talking about her because her real extraordinary contribution to civilization is saving these women, is what she did with this orchestra. And how she did it was extreme ferocity. Unquestionably, she was a disciplinarian. Unquestionably, she said to the other women, you play well or we all die.
We all die.
And so
it was together. They
yes,
often we go down together, doesn't it?
That's why it's so interesting. It's a team. It's the solidarity between them with these really different factions, and Polish women, several of whom still felt a strong vein of anti-Semitism. But when push came to shove, they pulled together. So, you know, one musician would not have survived performing solos. 3 musicians, no. It was the entire orchestra with their small subgroups that enabled the bigger entity to survive. And that was thanks to Alma. Now, people say, but wasn't she cruel? I don't think she was cruel. I think she said, you either play excellently so that the Nazis need us, or we all die. And there were teenagers who'd maybe had 2 years playing the recorder. It must have been a real struggle for them to play together. And she put some violinists at the back and said to them, all you have to do is play the downbeat, you know, just keep time. So go boom da da, boom da. And you think, well, that's easy enough. It's not easy when nothing is easy in Auschwitz, when you're freezing cold, starving hungry, wearing...
They didn't get more food, did they? So they
Not
got a different
much.
block, and
No.
they were allowed to wear their hair, but that was really pretty much about it.
I think having their own beds was a privilege, having access to a toilet. I think being given hope that they might survive. I think those are meagre privileges, but no, not much more food. Perhaps a visiting Nazi might come in and say, oh, play me this or play me that. And by the way, here's a bit of bread for your troubles. So they got occasional sort of bits and pieces, but no, not really
The
anything.
only reward she could give them, I love the story that the only reward she could give them, because she couldn't give them food or anything, was to play Mendelssohn's E minor, wasn't it, that she played? And that's, #1, that was incredible because she was a virtuoso, but also because there was very strict rules on what the orchestra could play. Because they were Jewish women, they weren't allowed to play the great German composers, were they?
Mendelssohn was forbidden because he was of Jewish origin, so no Mendelssohn publicly.
So she could play him secretly, yeah.
No Chopin because he was Polish and they hated the Poles.
And the Jews weren't allowed to play Wagner.
The Jews couldn't play great German or Beethoven because, you know, the great German composers were much too good for these low-life Jews. So, yeah, all these rules of what they could and couldn't play. So, you know, there was a bit of leha. And
some jaunty pop songs.
Yes.
He said they were being made to play these jaunty pop songs. Which
yes, that's
just
what
awful,
the Germans loved. Cinematic music, Bel Ami, and Isn't It a Lovely Day? And there's one odd piece called The Chinese Farmer Goes to Work. I mean, you know, there is no rationale. I mentioned earlier, and I meant to come back to it, the grand piano, because,
yes,
of course,
the piano.
A piano has no role in a marching band. But Alma, in her determination to save people, took a lot of singers. Now, the singers were useful for two reasons. First of all, they could do, you know, they may have been conservatory trained, so they were really professionals. They could do copying and arranging, and that was absolutely crucial with this lopsided band.
Because they had no music. There was no sheet music, was
well,
there?
There were odd bits, because, again, some Jews, when they came to the camp, packed, but odd bits.
Didn't they get a bit of music from one of the men's orchestras,
yes,
perhaps?
From the men's orchestras, or... mostly, you're completely right. They had to get plain music from the office, and some of the women were employed as copyists or arrangers, and they had to write all the staves out and then make the music tolerable for this really ragtaggle, lopsided band. So Alma, once she had this extraordinary power, because Mandel liked the orchestra and the Nazis thought it was wonderful that they had this orchestra, she was able to say, well, I've got all these singers and they're doing the arranging and the copying, but I need a piano to teach them. So they got a grand piano, and nobody knows quite where it came from. I mean, I'm sure it was just taken from a family in the neighbouring town, and eventually they had to give it back. But one of the singers, Fania Fenelon, remembers her audition playing, she sang Un bel di vedremo, accompanied by a Bechstein grand piano. It's so appallingly bizarre. I mean, I conclude that actually one shouldn't try and make sense of it, because once you try and explain the Nazi philosophy, I think you're almost lost. I think one just has to accept that it has no rational explanation. And all these aspects, the grand piano, the Greek woman, Yvette, who was taught the double bass because she'd been ill, so she lost her role as an accordionist, and her sister came up with the idea, well, I think Yvette could play the double bass. So the Nazis agreed to a man coming over from the men's camp to teach her the double bass. I really can't emphasize enough, the Nazi philosophy was not only to exterminate the Jews, but to exterminate Jewish culture. Yet they're allowing a Bechstein grand piano to teach these women to sing, a teacher for the double bass. So I was just saying, the two reasons why Alma had singers in the orchestra, one was because of her absolute determination to save as many Jews as she could. So she employed them as copyists and arrangers, but also they had, in these Sunday concerts that the Nazis loved because it was relaxation, to sing quartets, you know, the famous quartet from Rigoletto. So Fania Fenelon, this French woman, rewrote that for 4 female voices. And the Nazis loved it because they thought that opera was an art form they'd invented. And, you know, duets from The Merry Widow, you might expect. But it just is so bizarre to imagine a Sunday afternoon in Auschwitz hearing the quartet from Rigoletto for 4 voices.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because as you say, Alma created this really incredible orchestra, and this is why the Sunday concerts began, because the Nazis thought, you're so great, we want to have these 3-hour concerts. And they had these 3-hour concerts, and you say the music was so varied, and they had singers as well, and some of them were French resistance fighters, weren't they?
Yes,
singers. They
the French ones.
Claire, you got a picture of her in the book, haven't you? Rather glamorous French resistance fighters. And but the prisoners came to watch these concerts as well, didn't they?
Yes, so if on a sunny day, they would sit outside. In winter, they were inside in the wash house block, the sauna. But in winter, in summer they would sit outside, and because I've really tried to write not just about the orchestra, but a sort of 360-degree look at what the other prisoners thought of the orchestra, because for me
that was fascinating.
Really important part of the story. Of course, you can guess the other prisoners hated them. They thought they were collaborators. We can come back to Clermont-Nice. They assumed they were all offering sexual favours, that must be the nature of the privilege, the bargain that these women had struck. There is absolutely no evidence of sexual privilege or no evidence of any bargain. But the other women, and I've interviewed one of them who's still alive, who's looked after now in London by Jewish Care, and she really clearly remembers having to sit and listen to an orchestra, and she said it was just one more thing to endure. I didn't know anything about classical music. I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. It was just 3 hours on a Sunday, and I endured it. But other women, and this touches on where I got my information from. So there were 2 people I interviewed, and we're going to talk about Hilda, I know.
I love Hilda.
And a vast library of Holocaust books. But I think my most useful source of research are these incredible, not just audio testimonies, but audio-visual testimonies that Steven Spielberg created. Having made the money from Schindler's List, he set up the Shoah Foundation. And it's the most fantastic resource. It's not the only resource, but he interviewed these women in their 70s, 80s, 90s, when their memories were still clear. Hardly any of them can tell their story of being in Auschwitz and hearing the orchestra without at some point breaking down as they talk about what they saw and their families being gassed, and just the unbearable survival from day to day. But one of the women talks about having to sit and listen to this concert sitting on hot ashes. They all knew what was going on. There's nobody in Auschwitz who didn't know.
Yeah.
And as I've said, Alma said, if we don't play well enough, we'll all be sent to the gas. They knew that's what was happening. Many of them had arrived with their families, and their families had been sent one way to the gas. And they, if they were lucky, I hate to use the word lucky about Auschwitz, but fortunate to survive, went the other way, hoping that perhaps some work could be found for them. I just really cannot imagine what it must have been like to sit on the ashes of people that you may have known in another life. It is hard to imagine, and any survivor, I think that's the first thing they say to you. You can't imagine it unless you were there. And I don't know how many of you have been to Auschwitz. I'm just curious. Have any of you been? A few of you. Oh, well, quite a few of you. I mean, I had been to 5 camps before I started this book, all very different, and I really hoped I'd never have to go to Auschwitz. I just wrongly assumed that it had become a tourist trap, and I was so wrong. And it's so different from the other camps, and I really am passionate about urging everybody to go now, because you really can't imagine the size, the scale, the industrial nature of the killing. And that's what every survivor says. You can't imagine it. So I've tried to stick to quoting people who did live through it and survive it, and to put as little of my interpretation as possible. I've tried really hard not to sensationalize it, because, as one of the women said to me, it's sad enough as it is. You don't need to have adjectives about it. But as Anita said to me on various occasions, on the other hand, don't pretty it up. Don't pretend we were playing beautiful music. Don't pretend we looked attractive. We would stand for roll call with diarrhea pouring down our legs. And, those images, once you have been to Auschwitz, even if you can't imagine quite what it was like to be so cold and so hungry and so scared, I think when you listen to what the prisoners themselves said, you start to get an idea.
And I mean, the book is magnificent, but what's so moving is the voices that you give. You bring these women to life. You give the voices to life. It's their voices that you're foregrounding. And what I find so moving and so powerful is your point that any type of survival is resistance. Any type of survival. And this is what these women were doing. They were surviving. And Alma, of course, was ensuring that other people survived. And that was resistance.
In my book, it is. I mean, I'm asked to what extent was this collaboration. It's,
because the French communists, they were quite critical,
well,
weren't they?
of course the French communists were, because they had to go out to work and they had to step in time as they came back.
It's interesting, you see these accounts of women who were recruited to be enslaved sex workers in the brothels, and some of them were beaten up by the other women when they were found out because they thought it would be privileged. But of course,
no,
it was horrific.
It's not privileged, and I think anybody who survives, for me, that's the highest form of resistance, because it's a defiance of what the Nazis are trying to do, to kill you. But Primo Levi calls it the grey zone, which I think is useful. And he believes the greatest crime of the Nazis is the way they forced all the prisoners in their own image. Anyone who survives Auschwitz, arguably, is supporting the Nazi regime because it enabled all these sub-factories and munitions factories to keep on going. But what's the choice? You can throw yourself against the wires. You can try and have an uprising, and I detail at least 2 in the book, where everybody is killed, and not only are the people involved in the uprisings killed, but the retribution and the random nature of that the Nazis just spray gun anybody as punishment for the uprising. So surviving and keeping it going may have been a grey zone because you were doing the Nazi bidding, but ultimately you're surviving and able to bear witness. And I think that is such an important aspect, that these women are able to bear witness because they survived. And in looking at what was the motivation for the women, what was it that gave them the strength to want to live when they'd seen the worst that humanity has to offer? They'd seen their own families killed. Why would they want to live in this appalling world? Well, there are different reasons. One of the women I talk about wanted to live to get revenge on the people who'd betrayed her. One of the women wanted to live because she hoped her parents had survived in hiding, and to tell them about the death of her brother, their son, who hadn't lived. But a lot of the women wanted to live to bear witness to what had happened. And, Hilda, who
We've got to, so yes, I think haven't got too long before we must move to questions. I mean, I could talk for hours. You are such an incredible speaker, Anne, but I think we've just got to talk about Hilda, because this is the epilogue of your book. So your book was announced, and as you say, don't believe Wikipedia, because everyone said there was only one living member of the orchestra left, but there was another one, and you found her.
I know, aren't I lucky? Well, so the bookseller announced that I was going to write this book about 18 months after I'd started writing it. And everybody said there's only one surviving member, Anita, who's in London, who is 99, about to be 100 in a few weeks' time. And the granddaughter of another orchestra member living in Israel said, no, Hilda is still alive. It's just that she's a bit frail, so she's been moved into a different part of the kibbutz, so she's not answering the phone, but she's completely compartmented.
She's 99 as well.
She was 99, so what do you do with a 99-year-old? You get on a plane the next day to interview her, and thank goodness I did. I mean, Hilda is, I think, the sort of moral through line of the whole story. She was an only child in Germany who was offered a place on the Kindertransport. Her father had been sent back to Poland, where he was born. That's what the Germans did, even though they were living in Germany. So she was looking after her mother. Her mother was arrested. She turns down a place on the Kindertransport to be with her mother. even though her mother didn't survive. So eventually she gets to Auschwitz, she knows she's an orphan, and what keeps her going is this belief that there must be a better world, and her idea is that this better world will be a Jewish state. She's a Zionist, and that's what keeps her going. But she somehow creates order amongst the other women. And when they're in Belsen and she sits them all in a circle to hand out, and they submit to her being some form of leader, she makes sure that a different person starts the soup each day so that they each have their fair share. There are all sorts of other things Hilda does. I think the most courageous is when the Nazis separate them into Jewish and Christian and tell the Jewish women, get out of your clothes, leave everything behind, your jumpers, your food, you're going on a train to Belsen. Hilda, with not only great courage, but historical foresight, goes back into the block 12, and takes historical artifacts. She takes her volume of Faust, she takes Alma's diary, and she takes a little red bag that she'd sewn to carry the music around in. I mean, she could have been shot on the spot for that. And looks after these artifacts in Belsen because she knows there'll be Holocaust deniers.
They'll forget that it won't be believed.
Believed because it's such an extraordinary.
So powerful.
Isn't it? I mean, the guts and the courage. And she looks after them in Belsen, and they're now in Israel, in Yad Vashem. But when Hilda was interviewed and asked, you know, what made you behave in, and there are all sorts of examples of her behaving in this unbelievably noble way, she said, I knew I had to behave as well as I possibly could, because if you don't do that, what's the point of surviving? And it's such a simple mantra. And there are so many occasions when I think about it. You know, if I'm in a supermarket queue and someone's fumbling and can't find their card and I'm in a hurry and I really, you know, I'm bursting with, I'm in such a rush, and I think of Hilda, I think, just behave in the best possible way that you can, because otherwise there's no point. And in every day there's an instance when I think of Hilda and I think, just behave in the best possible way that you can, because otherwise, what's the point of surviving?
And
so
it's so powerful, isn't it, that in Belsen, to return to our beginning of the story, in Belsen, the Jewish women, they tried to continue with the orchestra, and they were initially disavowed, but they did continue. And then some of them, they actually ended up, you know, playing the Teddy Bears Picnic for the officers' children, didn't they?
well, that's Flora.
Yes, I can't quite believe the Teddy Bears Picnic.
No, I mean,
such a lovely little
so
song.
Cruel
yes.
that Kramer, who had his own house, picked a couple of these women because he recognised them from Auschwitz, and asked if they'd come and teach music to their children. And then eventually he got rid of them because they were dirty and they were bringing germs from the camp. So, but you know.
Yes, I mean, absolutely fascinating, incredibly moving and powerful. And I mean, Anne, I could talk to you all afternoon, but we must pause because we are now moving to questions from the audience, and we've got some online questions as well. We have a roving mic, two roving mics, sorry. So who would like to ask a question to start us off? Rebecca has got a question. Anyone has a good question?
Thank you. I was checking behind me to make sure there weren't other hands, because I don't want to use my kind of festival privilege. I was just wondered, Anne, if you could speak a little bit. I don't want to use the word self-care, but it's a really harrowing book to write and research, I imagine. What was the writing process like for you? And did you have moments where you just took yourself away from it just to clear your head?
It is such an interesting question. I just felt I had to record this while there are still people alive, that these stories mattered. I'm Jewish, and I grew up knowing these stories. I was born in 1951. There's never been a time when I haven't known that there were camps. My parents had a very close friend, I mean, really, one of their closest friends, who regularly came for dinner with numbers on her arm, So I've always known it. It wasn't as if I suddenly discovered, oh, you know, there were terrible things that the Nazis did. And as I say, I'd been to 5 other camps for my research. Buchenwald was one of the most shocking. I went there when Daniel Barenboim was conducting the East-West Divan Orchestra, and I was, with my journalistic hat, reporting it for the Times. And Barenboim was so interesting. He would be really, really strict with the talented Israeli violinist, because many of the rest of the orchestra from Syria or Iraq even, I mean, they had to be there in secret, and they didn't have any of the privileges, we keep using that word, that the Israeli musicians arguably had. So he was very, very strict, but on the other hand, they were in Weimar, and he made them all go to Buchenwald as part of the training of the East-West Divan Orchestra. And going to Buchenwald with a group of Middle East would-be musicians was intensely powerful. And I've been to Ravensbrück for my research on Les Parisiennes. And Ravensbrück, after the war, became a Soviet training camp. So it was arguably even worse than it was in Nazi times. And you get the train from Fürstenberg, which is just outside Berlin, and sitting on that train, you're sitting opposite a lot of German people who've been living in Fürstenberg for generations. And one of the women started chatting to me in a cheerful way and said, oh yes, my parents worked at Ravensbrück in the office because they could speak different languages. I thought, I don't know how you're telling me this with such a smile on your face. So, you know, what I'm saying to you is a long-winded way that there was almost nothing new almost. I mean, of course there was, and of course it was harrowing, but I just decided I had to tell it how it was, and that it was just so important while there are still people alive and while there's such a resurgence of anti-Semitism, trying to convey this moment in history just felt to me something that I had to do, which isn't to say I didn't occasionally have nightmares, because I did, but you're kind to use the word self-care. I don't think that's, I just feel very privileged actually to be telling this story.
And I think it's very important what you were saying, that it's impossible for us to imagine what it must have been like. Impossible for for any aspect of it, whether you're playing, and even though we might play in an orchestra today, there's no comparison to playing an orchestra, the marching band, when you might see friends or relations, you know, collapsing from exhaustion on the way in, but you've got to keep on, you know, playing away on your accordion. You can't stop.
And the extreme cold, I don't know what it is about Auschwitz, but it is very exposed. And I went on a November day in a thick down coat, and my hands were still blue. How do you play an instrument when your hands are blue, you've had nothing to eat, you've seen your parents die? I mean, that is an extraordinary feat of imagination to try and get yourself into the mindset, but it needed to be done.
Any more further questions? Oh, yes, one here, please. Thank you.
Firstly, just thank you for talking to us and also for recording these people's voices. As you say, you know, we're getting quite a few years on from the wars and the Holocaust now. What can we do now and in the future to ensure that these voices are still heard and these memories are still recorded, especially given the current climate?
I don't really know what we can do other than try and be tolerant of minorities in all sorts of ways. I mean, I can only... I didn't want a big conclusion at the end of my book. I didn't know how to finish it. That was one of the most difficult things. I was going to do a plea for, you know, here are 11 nations who managed to sink their differences and come together. And my editor said to me, no, that sounds like I'm a Remainer and it's a plea for Brexit. And, you know, it was not what I was trying to do. And in the end, I concluded with, you know, small acts of kindness, solidarity, sisterhood was the small groups of 3 Belgians or 2 Ukrainians who stuck together. And I come back to Hilda's words, just do the best you can, because otherwise, what are we here for? It doesn't have to be a grand statement of anything, but just listen and tolerance. And I'm sorry, I can't think of a bigger, grander gesture, but I am fortunate to have met so many survivors and to be an instrument of telling their story. As Anita says, it's better that I've survived and can go on telling the story, and education and learn, and the futility of war, but we don't seem to learn. I don't have a great answer. I wish I did, but we all do our best in whatever way we can, I think.
Those small acts of kindness, giving a little bit of your food ration to someone when they got back exhausted, were so meaningful.
And helping to tune an instrument, or I mean, the other thing that we haven't talked about, I have not written a feminist book. At no point did it occur to me that this was feminism until a Holocaust expert was sent my book to read and see if I'd made any howlers, and so far nobody's told me I have. I hope I haven't. But he said to me he thought this was really an insight into understanding the female experience in Auschwitz, because most of the scholarship actually has been about the male experience. So why is the female experience different? Well, for a number of reasons. For women in the 1930s, to be shaven was not something that was acceptable, whereas for men to be shaven-headed, it's like Yul Brynner, you're expressing your manhood. So there was the shaving that was a deeper humiliation for women. There was the nakedness. For women to appear naked at that time was often unheard of, and for mothers and daughters to be taken, and for daughters to see their mothers having to parade naked, that was a much deeper humiliation for women. And the other obvious thing is women getting their periods, or women not getting their periods because they were starved. So young women or adolescent women, if they were spared, hoping eventually to have children, and this terrible fear if they didn't get their periods, which is what happened, or the even worse fear if they did get their periods and they had no sanitary protection or anything.
Some of them were given old men's outfits, weren't they? And there was no underwear or anything.
No, I mean, for ordinary prisoners, there was no underwear at all. But for women who have their periods, they were given rags. So they didn't have their mothers often because their mothers were killed. Who was going to tell them? That's an obvious thing. Young girls rely on their mothers to explain what's happening to them and what to do. So other women had to step into that role of explaining what was happening and saying, well, you need some rags. There were no facilities for washing out rags. I mean, forgive me if this is too much information, but I think it's really, really important to understand why this was such an appalling experience for young girls and young women. So rags became a currency, in some cases even more precious than bread. So these are the small acts of kindness that you rely on. And the idea that rags were so precious you had to hang on to them for the next month, and you might have to go without bread, which you absolutely needed, because you also needed rags. So it's a new area of Holocaust scholarship, actually, and I stepped into it not realizing this is what I was doing. I was writing about a discrete story, which I felt absolutely needed to be told, but it touches on an area of historical research that is academically, people are starting to look into it specifically, and I'm very happy if I've contributed some small aspect to that.
So many powerful voices. Now, Rebecca, I think we've got about another 10 minutes or so, haven't we? And I think we've got some online questions, if we have any online questions.
Yeah.
Yes, oh, from there.
So could you tell us a little bit more about the survivors? Did all the women in the orchestra survive, or not many of them? And do you know much about the sort of relationships after the war
Yes.
for the survivors? And
Thank
kind
you.
of a slightly a sort of joined on question is, did you find any kind of moments of, I think you touched on sort of the word sisterhood or joy or, you know, any kind of beauty in the friendships and relationships between the women?
Yes. So post-war, it is interesting. Most of them had their love of music completely ruptured. There were only about 4 or 5 of them who would have been professional, but they couldn't go on to professional careers, other than Anita, who founded the English Chamber Orchestra, and a violinist, a Hungarian violinist called Lili Matei, who came to London and played at Lyons Corner House, but it wasn't the career that she hoped for. But anyway, music was not spoiled for her, but for many of these women, music was spoiled. The Polish women, yes, I mean, that's actually important to say. After the war, the Polish women, if they were Catholic, they could go home, but they were living in a communist country. So the connections between the women after the war were not strong until the fall of the wall, and then some of them came together. But I'm thinking, say, of Helena Dunitz, who was a conservatory-trained violinist, but she couldn't even go to a concert. And eventually she did work in music publishing. So post-war, their relationship with music was damaged. La Grande Hélène, she was called La Grande Hélène, a Belgian called Hélène Viernik, and she would have been a very talented violinist, but she was the one who had to go home and tell her parents what had happened to their son, and she could not play anymore. She said it wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Being a concert pianist requires great reserves of energy, and she'd been broken. So I think post-war, those who survived, by and large, did not become musicians. But you asked, did they all survive? Almost all. I mean, there are 1 or 2 one woman, Yeti Cantor, who actually refused to join the orchestra right at the end because she'd seen all her family killed, and she just couldn't play music again after that. But she survived and went back to Holland, and she did have a career as an actress. 2 of them died in Belsen from typhus, because they weren't deliberately gassed in Belsen, but the disease and illness and starvation and their weak levels of immunity meant that survival was really touch and go in Belsen, and had it not been liberated on April the 15th, I don't think many of them could go on much longer. It was really just in time. So almost all the orchestra who had played under Alma did survive. So she very definitely saved. It's hard to put a precise number on it. I say almost 50, more than 40, because a couple of them joined and left. And then it was difficult after the war. The Russians just were completely lost. There were at least 3 Russian Red Army women who shouldn't have been there in the first place in Auschwitz. They should have been in a prisoner of war camp. But what happened to them after the war, all trace has been lost. And I think the individual groups who remain friendly, mostly, if I'm making a generalization, mostly, like anyone who survived, they wanted to get on with their lives, have children, create normality, and put this completely out of their minds. But as they reached an elderly age, when they became grandparents, I love interviewing people who are really at the end of their life, because I think most people want to make sense of their lives. They like to believe there's a narrative arc, that they've lived for a purpose. So they may not have talked about it immediately, but when they have grandchildren, you find they often do willingly talk about their experiences. And the Orchestra of Women were no different. So, and once they start talking, they go into schools and they talk and talk and talk. But Anita, because she was a musician, because she was traveling, she calls herself, I was the moving target. So she did see a number of the women, and she had a very vivid correspondence in the, not when she was 90, but in the 1990s, with the Polish women with whom the relationships had been so difficult in the bloc. And they realized in old age that actually they had much more in common than that which divided them. And strangely, I asked her when I met her if she'd had anything to do with Lily Maté, because both of them were in London. And she said to me, oh, well, I did bump into her and John Lewis once. But that was it, you know, because they actually were very different. They had very different styles of music. And I mean, that's partly it. I think it's partly a desire not to relive this awfulness, but a couple of the women who had been born in Poland, and then the Polish Jewish women who went to Israel, when they decided they were strong enough to go back to Auschwitz, they did make it their business to look up the Polish Catholic women. So slowly, slowly, there was some sort of pulling together at the end, but it wasn't close between the different religions. However, for Hilda, for the German women, the Belgian women, the French, for the Jewish performers, they did have some sort of reunion phone call every April the 15th. They called April the 15th, when Belsen was liberated, their new birthday. And for Hilda and Anita, it was very important to speak on April the 15th. And I feel so touched because Anita didn't know Hilda was still alive. And when I discovered that she was, she said, but we must speak on April the 15th. And then, of course, she couldn't get through on the phone and it was difficult. But in the last year, they did speak once more on April the 15th. So I feel very gratified that at least before Hilda died, there was one last phone call on April the 15th. So it's not straightforward as to whether they kept in touch or didn't, but there was some communication.
I mean, that is incredible. And I mean, I think that is an incredible... we could go on talking much more, and so many questions, but that is, I think that's an incredible note to end on, the thought of these women on April the 15th meeting up and calling it their new birthday is so powerful. Well, I mean, this is a fantastic book. I would recommend it. Anne's going to be signing outside, so if there's questions that you didn't have a chance to answer, she'll be available there, and it is an absolutely incredible book, so magnificent, so powerful, and all this primary research, this absolute primary research. You've spoken to the women, you've read their testimonies, and brings this, as you say, this unlooked at corner of history, which has been overlooked because it's, well, women's history. So it's just absolutely incredible. And it's been such a privilege to interview you, Anne. Thank you so much for coming to us and giving us all the generosity of your time and your thoughts and your perspective. It's been wonderful to have you.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Kate.
much for coming, everyone. It's been
brilliant.
great to see you here.
You.
And thank you for having us.